I think pretty frequently about how close we've come before to the use of nuclear weapons and what that might mean once we cook one off. And I think a lot about the current international environment and the incentives and uncertainties that have become injected into the environment recently, and how that might incentivize horizontal nuclear proliferation, and what that might mean for the likelihood of an accidental or intentional nuclear war.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original brought to you by Firecracker Farm. Today, we're going to be talking about nuclear proliferation, or hopefully the end of nuclear proliferation. My guest today is Glenn Chafetz. Glenn is a former CIA analyst and a leading expert on strategic culture, national security, and nuclear deterrence. He served in various roles within the U.S. intelligence community, focusing on post-Soviet states, weapons of mass destruction threats, and the geopolitical behaviors of emerging nuclear powers. He is the director of the 2430 Group, a national security consultancy, and has published widely on foreign policy, intelligence, and cultural drivers of state behavior. Let's get into the episode. A subject that I hear about often, but I really don't spend a lot of time diving deep on, and I think this is for most people, nuclear proliferation. You hear it, and I'm sure most people, it's hit their radar recently in conversations around Iran, right? This, the attempt or the stop of Iran achieving nuclear material, even though they were well on their way to enrichment. Before we even get into it, I'm curious, how did you find interest in this particular topic? Of all the things in the world to dive deep on, how did this one do it for you?
Yeah, I started, great question. I started my career, and I'm giving away my age here, as a Sovietologist. I was in graduate school, working on a PhD in Soviet studies, international politics. The Soviet Union collapsed. I was still very interested in all things Russian and former Soviet Union. And one of the big issues of the day back then, in the late 80s and early 1990s, is what would happen to Soviet nuclear stockpiles, and how would that affect the number of countries that could acquire nuclear capability, or even at that time could simply take acquisition of and control of nuclear weapons. So that's how I got into it. And I became more and more fascinated really with the question of, why don't more countries try to acquire nuclear weapons than have already tried to? That to me was a really interesting question, because the dominant assumption and thinking at the time is countries will get whatever kind of power and weapon system that they can acquire. And that wasn't happening. In fact, many countries that could be nuclear decided not to become nuclear. Countries that had nuclear weapons, like South Africa, gave them up. Countries that were well on their way, like Argentina and Brazil, gave up those programs. Countries that could easily cross that threshold and become nuclear, like Japan, Germany, decided that was not something they wanted to do. So that was an interesting question for me.
Is there a through line I mean, obviously there's probably different reasons depending on the country, but was there a consistency across that in those countries that were either past the threshold or could easily eclipse it, that they decided that they just didn't want to go down that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one that has a variety of answers. I think part of the reason is, as you make that decision and you cross into an effort to acquire fissile material, to enrich uranium or acquire or reprocess plutonium, you're going to garner a lot of attention from the international community. And we've seen that with Iran. We've seen that with North Korea. Um, we certainly saw that with Iraq in the 1990s. A number of countries decided it's more trouble than it's worth. The negative attention that we garner, the cost, which is significant, the financial cost, the opportunity costs are significant, and they simply don't out justify the gains in security that we'd get. I, I, I mean, I would point out that the countries that do have nuclear weapons still face international security problems. You don't see the United States, Russia, China, France, Britain, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, India saying, "Well, I have nuclear weapons. It's all good now. I don't
Yeah,
have any
problem solved.
security concerns. I haven't solved. Yeah, I've solved all those problems." That hasn't happened, and so I think countries like Germany and Japan and South Korea and Turkey and Sweden and all these countries which have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, they look at that and think, okay, um, the game isn't worth the candle there.
Yeah, the juice might not be worth the squeeze. Could you? I think a lot of people are familiar with the atomic age.
Yeah, yeah,
Oppenheimer, and again, maybe whether it was through a movie or they're studying World War
right,
II. I'm glad
yeah,
that
yeah,
they are aware of it. But the atomic age and the nuclear age, a little bit different. Can you kind
yeah,
of paint the brush of how, doing a little bit of research? There's considered to be 9 countries that we're at least aware of that have a nuclear weapons capability.
yeah,
Can you try kind of just bring us up from where the development of that and how these countries came on board and kind of paint a picture of where we are at today?
yeah. I think most people are familiar with uh, Albert Einstein and his work, and he wrote a famous letter to Franklin Roosevelt, and which said that splitting the atom is possible, and this has the potential for creating a very fearful and powerful weapon. This is something that we should work on because I think, based on my knowledge of the scientists still remaining in Nazi Germany, this was in the 30s, uh, the Nazis are certainly pursuing that research with that goal in mind. Roosevelt started the Manhattan Project. The United States developed by 1945 an atomic weapon, uh, which was tested in Los Alamos, and everybody who saw the movie Oppenheimer saw that process. Uh, at that very time, the United States was working closely with Great Britain, so Britain was moving down the process of developing that capability as well. And sadly, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had fairly well penetrated the United States government and particularly the atomic weapons program with their intelligence services and had acquired most of the information necessary to develop their own bomb. So you have really at the end of World War II, by the time the United States is tested and then used two of the weapons on Japan, uh, this three countries well on their way toward nuclear capability. The United States, which was obvious at the time, Great Britain, which everybody expected, and then finally the Soviet Union, which tested its first weapon in 1949.
What was their mechanism to infiltrate the Manhattan Project so effectively? Was it just because we were relying on scientists from a variety of backgrounds? Because it seems like they basically got access to for the layman's term, the schematics on how to build one of these, even though I bet you they describe that in different terms technically.
I mean, this was old-fashioned human intelligence work. This was the Soviets made it a priority. Uh, They recruited people mainly on the basis of ideological affinity.
Mm.
You have to remember this is the 1930s. In the 1930s, uh, the world was under great stress, the Great Depression. Uh, Left-wing ideologies were probably at their height of popularity in the United States, and the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States from June of 19 well, from December of 1941 until at least the end of the war. And so many of the young, idealistic, naive scientists working on the Manhattan Project in the United States, whether they were foreign born or not,
Yeah.
um, thought, well, the Soviet Union is our ally. Um, we're all friends. Sure, this is supposed to be restricted, but it's probably a bad idea for just one country to have this. And going forward with that faulty, naive point of view, the Soviets systematically found these people, approached them, preyed upon their ideological sympathies, and used other techniques well known to intelligence. Some of it was money, some of it was romance, some of it was preying on psychological needs, and convinced enough people working on the project to share the information that they had so that the Soviets could piece together enough so that they could build their own bomb.
Wow. Yeah. So largely we did the work for them.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I would hesitate to put a number on it, but it was certainly most of the work, probably well over 90%. Let me also take a minute to just say, I know we're discussing this because of the article in Defense One. I should note I had a co-author, a man named Zachary Davis, who had a long, stellar career in this area, most recently at Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Labs, where he thought about these issues for a living, and he's recently retired. And I have to give him credit for educating me on a lot of these issues.
Oh, no, I definitely appreciate it and you passing the knowledge along. So let's talk the jump from the atomic age to the nuclear age. How did this play itself out?
Yeah, it's an interesting use of terminology. I don't know that it's really uh, accurate in the scientific terms. The real big jump, I think, the real big advances were from the original fission bombs, which we know about from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to thermonuclear weapons, fusion
Hmm.
bombs, what was called back then the super, which are many, many, many thousands of times more powerful than so-called atomic weapons, the fission bombs. So we really went from thousands of kilotons equivalent of TNT in the size and explosive power of the weapons to millions of tons, from kilotons to megatons.
Yeah.
And so we went from teens, 20 kilotons to 3, 5, 10, 20. I think the Soviets actually tested a 50 megaton explosive at one point during the 1950s or 60s.
Wow.
Um, they're not comparable weapons.
And then how did the proliferation of those nuclear weapons go? So, the US is working on it, like you said, the
Yeah,
UK, Russia
yeah,
is coming along with us. And then how did it
yeah,
start to spread out to the nine countries that now,
yeah.
and the
So
known nine countries in air quotes for those of you
yes,
just listening that have nuclear
yeah,
weapons?
yeah. It's a great point known because the steps to acquire the capability are not necessarily obvious until you get to a certain point and people looking. Um, But um, after the first three, then France and China quickly followed in the early 60s. I believe China in 64, France right about that time. Forgive me, I don't have that. And then really working hard at that time were India and Israel. Israel acquired its capability. Most people think somewhere in the late 1960s, certainly before the Yom Kippur War of 1973, because there's good evidence that it considered using its nuclear weapon or weapons during that conflict. Then, if I'm not mistaken, we have Pakistan, which tested a weapon, I believe, in 1998. India tested in 1974. Interestingly, Israel, to common knowledge, has never tested a weapon. And then North Korea very recently, just in the last few years. I would say that the next big step apart from acquiring the nuclear weapons themselves are the various means of delivery. And the main one that most countries pursued first was via bomber aircraft, after that missile, and then after that submarine.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal. It's not just heat, it's flavor that elevates everything that you cook. The best thing to happen to food since fire. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with that. It's delightful. One of the best things about this brand is there's a real person behind it. His name is Alex, and he makes these in small batches, so it's not always easy to get. You don't want to miss out. All of the flavors are great. I have tried all of them. You really can't go wrong. Seriously, try it on everything. Steaks, vegetables, everything in between. I love cooking. I like cooking at home. I don't like putting sauces and overbearing things on the things that I cook, so I tried a little bit of the salt. And if I'm being honest, I tried a little bit too much the first time. It was a little spicy. So I had to back it off a little bit, and it made everything that I cook at home taste better. So it's an easy addition to the things that I already make. It tasted amazing. I was using the product for well over 6 months before Alex reached out to present as the sponsor for Change Agents. Easy peasy. I was already doing it. No additional time, a touch point with it in my personal life. I can talk about it from personal experience. Love what the brand stands for. Love what the brand was founded around. Enjoy the person who founded the brand. I mean, this is a match made in heaven. Get out of the comfort zone of what you can get in the grocery store. Go online to Firecracker Farm and use the code Ironclad for 15% off of your first order. You're going to be shocked at how much more of a flavor it brings out in what you cook. What would you say when you look at U.S. policy, when we're looking at national security? How big of a role did nuclear geez, get it out of my mouth.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
It really is. Nuclear non-proliferation. There we go.
Yeah.
Just for the editor, can cut and paste that every time I garble it. Yeah.
I get it wrong all the time. I always go to spread of nuclear weapons.
Oh, that's not bad.
Nuclear non-proliferation is hard to say.
Yeah. But it is a part, yeah, it is. Well, this ties into the article that you guys just wrote, the Defense One article that you mentioned. You had your co-author.
Yeah.
I feel like it has been a very large part of U.S. national security projection abroad. And I don't think we're the only country that's like that. How have you seen that? How have you seen that shift? And then bring me into the article that you wrote and why you guys decided where the impetus came from for that article.
Right.
So I'm interested in the consequences of it.
Yeah. As the United States and the Soviet Union in particular saw China and France come online with nuclear capability, nuclear weapons capability, that's when it really ramped up. The United States and the Soviet Union understood from the beginning that the genie was out of the bottle and other governments at some point, at some time, would want this capability, particularly if they faced significant security challenges. So take the case of Israel and India, which came next after the five
Mhm.
who were permitted under the Treaty of 1967 to keep their weapons for a time, until such time as all states denuclearized. India faced a serious security threat from China. They had fought a border war in 1962. Once India decided to acquire nuclear weapons, Pakistan, its main adversary, decided it had to have nuclear weapons. So you see how India acquires the weapons
Yep.
principally to provide deterrence against China. Pakistan sees that India acquires the weapons and decides it has to have the weapons to deter India. The United States uh, really led the way on this, aided by France and the UK, and to a certain degree, the Soviet Union and China, and said, "Wait, we should figure out a way to disincentivize proliferation of nuclear weapons." The assumption being that five nuclear weapon states was dangerous, 10 nuclear weapon states was more dangerous, 75 nuclear weapon states was significantly more dangerous. This is the assumption, and I think that assumption is valid.
I would
And
tend
we
to
can talk
agree.
about that after we cover this point, because I think it's worth discussing why more is worse. Um, so they conclude this treaty, and the treaty is basically a bargain, which says um, for countries that don't have nuclear weapons, they agree not to develop nuclear weapons. The countries with nuclear capability will help them develop civilian nuclear capability and will provide security for them and will uh, also eventually get rid of their own nuclear weapons. So those were the three explicit and implicit parts of the bargain. We'll give you civilian peaceful nuclear technology. We will get rid of our own nuclear weapons. And for those countries who believe that they have uh, an unsolvable security threat through their own means, let's take Germany and Japan as an example. In order to incentivize them not to acquire their own nuclear capability, the United States will cover them under its so-called nuclear umbrella, so that the Soviet Union would be just as deterred from using nuclear weapons against Germany and Japan and Norway and Belgium, et
Yep.
cetera, et cetera, et
Yep. That
cetera,
makes sense.
South Korea, as it would against the United States. This is called extended deterrence. So that was really the bargain of nuclear nonproliferation. It always existed under some degree of tension, as you can see, because other countries did acquire nuclear weapons. Israel did not want to leave its fate in other people's hands. It had historical reasons for doing so. Um, it feared that other countries, adversaries, for example, Egypt, was pursuing nuclear weapons. So it didn't buy the bargain. A number of countries said, we'll adhere to the bargain if you get rid of your nuclear weapons, but you don't appear to be doing it. So you had a variety of reactions. And then certain countries, for domestic political reasons, simply said it's not tenable for us to forego nuclear weapons. North Korea sees having nuclear weapons as a matter of national survival.
Yeah.
Pakistan does as well. The leader at the time, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, famously said in response to someone talking about the cost of nuclear weapons. We will eat grass if necessary, but we cannot allow India to have nuclear weapons while we do not.
I mean, that's pretty straightforward as far as the statement goes.
Yeah, so you had a variety of different assumptions, you had a variety of different interests, you had a variety of different responses. I think candidly most analysts predicted that many more countries would have nuclear weapons by now than do. I mean, to think that we went very quickly, really in a matter of 2 decades,
Yeah.
from 45 to the late 60s, say before Israel and India, where we went from 2 to 5, and then 5 to 7, and then 7 to 9. I think one of the reasons that we thought that the article was called for is Zach Davis and I believed, as the security guarantees and the alliances start to shift or perhaps weaken or become less certain under the current order, the current direction of the international environment right now, and particularly U.S. foreign policy, a number of countries would rethink their decision about the value of U.S. extended deterrence. If the U.S.
Yeah.
Under the current administration is saying, as it has, alliances are transactional, we're not sure it's worth it for us to protect you, then it's perfectly rational for the countries in the alliance to say, well, in addition to paying more for our defense and spending more on conventional defense, perhaps this also means that we should investigate or perhaps even make the decision to cross the nuclear weapons threshold.
When did that vernacular start appearing in the current administration? I'm trying to think back. I'm going to be honest with you. I get exhausted by the political cycle, so I pay attention as much as possible. Impossible to track everything that everybody is saying.
Yeah.
Was that something that I know that Trump ran on?
Yeah.
My words, not necessarily his, and I'm painting with a broom here.
Right.
Other countries in NATO need to, they need to satisfy their 3% of GDP. We're tired of footing the bill for this. So was that kind of the beginning of this change in the extended deterrence policy?
Yeah, I think that's right, Andy. I think it started during his first administration, where he really questioned the value of NATO, not just the degree to which the burden was shared among the different allies, which has always been an issue in the alliance. Burden sharing has always been an issue. How much does the United States pay for? How many troops does the United States keep in Europe? To what degree are the European allies, not just European, Canada as well, to what degree are they free riding, so to speak? Or if not free riding, not paying their fair share. Every president has raised this issue. I think that the Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, went beyond this during his first administration, during the campaign for the next election, and then after taking office, and questioned the value of NATO itself. Because what does NATO provide? Some people believe that this was a negotiating tactic in the burden sharing discussion. Perhaps. I think the allies and most analysts took him at his word that he was wondering, what is the value of NATO in today's world? He has a number of advisors, for example, who believe that the United States should prioritize Asia and cannot afford to defend Europe as well as Asia. And Europe is wealthy enough and advanced enough so that it can defend itself. I personally think this plays into the hands of Putin and Xi, who are allied and that Russia and China are part of the same problem, so that by splitting that alliance, by leaving NATO, as it were, on its own, we would be playing into the hands of Putin and Xi, who always wanted to split the alliance. Recently, there's been some movement back toward valuing NATO. That that less support for Russia, more support for NATO in the rhetoric and the policy of the administration. So we may be seeing the pendulum swinging back. It's difficult to tell. It's moving. The shifts are moving very, very quickly compared to how they had moved over the previous 75 years. And
Yeah.
so it's almost dizzying for people who are trying to understand and analyze the situation.
And that extends beyond the proliferation front.
For sure.
I'm not a political
Yeah.
expert by any stretch. I've done some episodes with people who are, talking about trade and tariffs. And
Yeah.
one of them, and this was a
Yeah.
few weeks ago, I'd mentioned there was 146 different, essentially trade policies or tariff policies
Right.
that had come out.
Right.
And given that was a few weeks ago, I'm
Right.
hearing
Right.
them. I'm not tracking them all the time, but we're probably 160, 170.
Yeah.
So there's people, it's like a flagpole that it's really kind of whipping around in the wind. Yeah, I don't know if something were like that in my life, in my personal life. The natural reaction is to be unsettled. It is to be concerned. It is to be
Well,
cautious
exactly.
and curious about what's
Yeah.
going on. I totally get it.
That is you've hit exactly on the point. So what you have is allies like South Korea and Japan, Germany, uh, uh, probably the three who could nuclearize the most rapidly. Looking and asking the question, okay, here is the policy from the United States today. It's better from our perspective than the policy from last week. Will it remain the policy next
It's a $1
week?
million question.
And so it is rational for those countries who have to plan to go to worst case scenario thinking. What happens if the current administration goes back to the pro-Russian, NATO skeptical, ally skeptical, transactional view of June or May? Where am I going to be then? I have to plan for the worst case. And this was not something that those countries had to do during any of the previous administrations, whether they were Democratic or Republican. It didn't matter. There was consensus in the United States that NATO and our other alliances, Japan, Australia, South Korea, were in America's interest. These alliances were not viewed as drags on the United States. They were viewed as additions to U.S. power, as a benefit to the United States. And so to have someone come in and not just question the degree to how the burden was shared, but the fundamental question of the value of the relationship was something new for them, and I think dizzying, uprooting for them.
Yeah. You and your co-author in the article described it as a potential domino effect should people,
Yes.
or not people, but actually people by proxy, but countries,
Yeah.
if they realize or feel that they are no longer under the umbrella of that extended deterrence, how would you hypothesize nuclear proliferation? What do you estimate would be that path if the countries realize, okay, I got to do this on my own? How do you think it would play out?
Yeah. It's tough. We hypothesized simply based on one, access to nuclear technology, wealth, and security concerns. That, for example, as Iran, for example, gained a weapon, and North Korea gained a weapon, and the United States extended deterrence was no longer trustworthy, then certain states would say, well, I'm no longer under extended deterrence, and I don't want to sacrifice freedom of action. So, take Germany, for example, had always behaved as if the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent was there to deter first the Soviet Union and then Russia from using nuclear weapons against Germany, even from attacking Germany with conventional weapons. Well, if that's no longer as certain as it was, then perhaps Germany should acquire nuclear weapons. Well, if Germany acquires nuclear weapons, what does that mean? What other countries are going to look to acquire nuclear weapons? Well, if Germany acquires nuclear weapons, will Germany provide that extended deterrence to Poland? Or does Poland need its own nuclear weapon? If Poland gets a nuclear weapon, what other countries decide that they need nuclear weapons? Will that spawn more vertical proliferation? So you have horizontal proliferation, which is more countries get access to the weapon, and then vertical proliferation is countries that already have access to the weapon decide that they need more weapons. So what does that do for Russia? What does that do does Ukraine decide, okay, I've denuclearized as part of the Budapest Memorandum of 1993, but we can already see that might have been a mistake, given that Russia violated that agreement in 2014 and 2022. Does it pursue nuclear capability? And on and on and on. Same thing with Iran. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, do its neighbors decide perhaps they need nuclear weapons? Does Turkey not want to have? And Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I don't imagine, would be too keen on its main adversary in the Middle East having a capability that it did not have and could not deter. Now, if Saudi Arabia gets nuclear weapons, then you start looking at other countries. I could bore your listeners, your audience, to tears by going further and further. I'll shorten this by saying I think the way it plays out is it accelerates. I think that 1 to 2 took some time, 2 to 5 took some time, 5 to 7 took some time, 7 to 9 didn't take as much time.
Yeah.
I think when we start that next tranche, it's going to happen even more rapidly, and then so on and so on and so on. And then that gets us to the question that we discussed earlier. So what? And that's where I like to bring up what I call the 40th floor problem. And apologies to whomever I stole this from. It's certainly not original with me, but someone in my life way back when used to use this metaphor all the time, not just about nuclear proliferation. You jump off the 100th story of the Empire State Building or Burj Al Khalifa, pick your building. You pass the 40th floor as you're falling and you say, so far, so good. I think I think we see that dynamic with proliferation because people say, well, no one's used nuclear weapons since August of 1945. Therefore, deterrence is perfect and it won't happen. There have been a number of near misses. There have been a number of times where they've almost been used. I am not sanguine at all about deterrence being perfect. I think the more countries that have their fingers on the trigger, the more likely those weapons will be used. I mean, I think about the analogy, you're in a dark theater where everybody's frightened, and one person does a negligent discharge. I think the result's going to be bad. And I think it's the same thing. If you start getting 10, 15, 20, 25 countries with nuclear weapons, eventually we will have an accident or an unintended use or a misperception. And we will have a use of nuclear weapons that might not be contained.
Yeah, I mean, that's global consequences for sure. Species impacting
Yeah.
for sure for every species to include human
Yep.
beings. Yeah, I don't think you put that one back in the closet. Like the horse leaves the
No.
barn on that one. And
Yeah.
whew. I'll be curious here too, as far as the proliferation goes. How do you think China would respond if Taiwan pursued a nuclear weapon or Japan?
Oh, really, a great question. Uh,
Or if they were given
I,
one, they sourced one through other means.
it's a great question. I don't obviously have an e- evidence-based answer because it's never happened. I can imagine that would precipitate an immediate uh, blockade, if not invasion. I don't think Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China will tolerate uh, a nuclear armed Taiwan. And I think if they thought that they were close to having a operational weapon that could be delivered to the People's Republic of China, China would react with military force.
What is what are China's thoughts on nuclear proliferation? Do they seem to care either way as long as they're good? They have a basket full. They don't really care what
Yeah,
other people do.
China thinks really in terms of the preservation and power of the regime of the Communist Party of China. Uh, China's Communist Party under Xi Jinping uh, is extremely insecure, and they think first and foremost of regime protection. This is a bit different to conceive of for Americans and others who come from democratic, law-based countries where the particular leader at the time is a steward of a larger thing, the United States of America in our case. Um, so American leaders, they're not trying to preserve their own particular power. Not to say that they don't have narrow political interests or that they want their party to win the next election, but their interest is in preserving the health, welfare, safety, security of the United States of America. The Communist Party of China thinks very differently. Um, it, China, to them, is the Communist Party of China, and democracy by its very existence is an affront to a Communist Party of China rule, to CCP rule. Taiwan is so objectionable to Xi Jinping because it is an example to 1.3 or 1.2 billion, however many people China really has. It, it is an affront to the CCP's rule over all of those people without the rule of law, without accountability, without elections, without democracy. Um, and so this is why Taiwan is such an obsession with the mainland, with the CCP, and why your question is so good, and why I think the CCP would react so violently to the imminent prospect of Taiwan acquiring a nuclear capability, because that would be able to perhaps deter an invasion from China once Taiwan got that capability, or inflict an unacceptable amount of damage.
How close, you mentioned this a little bit, that we've gotten relatively close to letting one of these things off the chain. How close do you think it's actually gotten? Not an
My,
accidental, like, whoopsie, push the wrong button here, but a targeted use of a nuclear weapon.
yeah, I don't think that distinction really matters too much,
I don't
Andy,
think it
because
does either.
yeah, because, and I mean,
Once the mushroom
people
cloud
live,
goes up, like
right,
there's
right.
no walking that
Oh,
back.
oh, my bad. I
Yeah.
didn't mean to do that. I just don't. Doctor Strangelove and other movies have addressed this issue. With the one with Matthew Broderick Broderick in the 1980s, where
Oh, war
he
games.
war
Shall we
games.
play a game?
Shall we play a game? Yeah. Um, I don't think it much matters once you, as you say, the mushroom cloud appears and millions of people die. I think we've come close a number of times. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Scott Sagan called The Limits of Safety, who talks about this very issue. Um, the Soviets came very close to launching a retaliatory strike on a phantom radar image. I believe it was in 1983. The Soviets came close to launching a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October of 1962 in response to the United States Navy. Uh, Go Navy, in your honor. Uh, 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 Forcing submarines up, Soviet submarines during uh, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There have been a number of other occasions, and probably some we don't know about, where the Soviets and the United States came close. The Soviets considered using nuclear weapons against China during their skirmishing and military conflicts of the late 1960s. I think it's really luck that has prevented, in great measure, uh, an accidental or misperceived use of nuclear weapons to this point. I am not at all calm or sanguine. I don't suffer from the 40th floor problem. I think that many people suffer from. I think the more countries that have their finger on the trigger, that have the capability, that have the means to deliver them, I think at a certain point, it's a near certainty.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. Timing is everything. Uh, right. I know that eventually the sun will grow and swallow up the earth. That doesn't really occupy my mental space too much because it's going to be so far in the future. But I
We
think the
hope. We
possibility.
don't know what's happening next week.
Well, that's true.
I'm also
Scientists tell me
hopeful that is long in
I
the
can
future.
relax about that. There's asteroids. There's other things that can cause extinction level events,
For sure.
and you raise a good point. But again, I don't let that fill my headspace. I think pretty frequently about how close we've come before to the use of nuclear weapons and what that might mean once we cook one off.
Yeah.
And I think a lot about um, the current international environment and the incentives and uncertainties that have become injected into the environment recently, and how that might incentivize um, horizontal nuclear proliferation, and what that might mean for the likelihood of an accidental or intentional nuclear war.
Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I agree with you that, in my opinion, or our opinions align, I should say, that the more proliferation there is of nuclear arms, the likelihood of one being used accidentally or intentionally certainly goes up. One of the things that worries me is, we're all just, at the end of the day, whether we have these nuclear weapons or not, we're human beings. And somebody's
Right.
probably going to make a decision about using one of these things. But we make our decisions based off the information we have access to. And we're living in a
Right.
world where we are bombarded by information. And not all of it is real. And the ability, I look at things like, not that I'm an expert in any of these, but cyber attacks or hacking, and it's actually
Yeah.
interesting. This goes all the way back to the Matthew Broderick film, War
Yeah.
Games, which, for people who haven't seen it, spoiler alert, it's like 40 years old. This is your bad now, because I'm going to go ahead and give away the ending. It almost goes into a nuclear arms race between Russia, or nuclear launch between Russia and the
Yeah.
U.S. It was all based off of, though, essentially, using a modern term, disinformation. The
Yes.
computer was playing a game. I mean, I look
Yes.
at AI now in videos, and they're almost indiscernible, and where it's like the 5th generation, but the 10th generation is like 2 years away. And information we're bombarded, and it's not all real, and people are
Right.
manipulated. So these people making these decisions, I'm curious where you think this just bolus of information and how things can be manipulated and attacked and hacked. How do you think that ties into the matrix?
Yeah, I think the answer is implied in your question, Andy, and I think it's an excellent question. And I think the AI point is a really, really troubling possibility to think about because we've had the problem of phantom launches before. We had the example, I think it was 1983, where a Russian launch officer decided that what looked to everybody else as a U.S. launch at a time of very heightened tensions
Hmm.
when the Soviets were very, very afraid that the United States was going to launch a preemptive strike. People didn't live through the Cold War or didn't study the Cold War. Again, I was in college when this happened. I mean, this is what people were thinking about, and this really scared the Soviets. It really scared the United States. They deepened their discussions about confidence building measures and ensuring no accidental nuclear war. Ronald Reagan famously watched war games, and he famously also watched the movie. Again, I'm blanking on the title. Jason Robards about what happens when there's a launch. And there was a nuclear war, a nuclear winter, and this was part of his reasoning for SDI and the Strategic Defense Initiative. He didn't want to leave the security of the American people to um, MAD, mutually assured destruction,
Yeah.
because he didn't think it would work necessarily. And you know, it's interesting to me as a nonfiction guy, as a former professor of international politics, as a current analyst, how instructive these fictional depictions were and the influence that they had on decision makers. And so you give that administration credit for thinking about these issues. He famously asked, "Do we really want to put the security and safety of the country in in the hands of a policy known as MAD?"
It's a great
Now there were
question.
problems with SDI and its workability and whether it created more of an incentive for a nuclear arms buildup. But the thinking was, "W- we need to keep these things in our hands, and we need to make sure that there's no accidental launch." And I think your point about greater automation, greater computerization, greater artificial intelligence, not intentionally telling those who are in control of nuclear weapons that there is in fact a launch or there is a drop or there's an explosion. Can we trust data that we no longer control and that the frontier AI labs are telling us have an unsolvable tendency to hallucinate right now? I mean, do we do we do we want to proceed with the development of AI, not to even say using it in our nuclear command and control, but using it at all and then unintentionally finding it in our command and control? Those are really great questions, Andy, and I don't have the answer, but I'm really troubled by the possibilities.
I mean, I've seen the movie Terminator. I would like to avoid that.
Again, life imitates art, imitates life, imitates art.
I agree. No, I have
Yeah.
a great quote from you, and I'd love for you to unpack this. You said that trust, not treaties, is the real foundation of global security. I think it's
Yeah.
fantastic. What does that look like in practice to you?
Yeah. I think people tend to focus on when they look at international politics on the things that go wrong. It's like the 6 o'clock newsification of international politics. Um, the things that make the news are wars and conflicts and disputes and fights and hacking and covert action and all of that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is, most of the international relationships uh, globally are are peaceful and productive, and they're based on relationships that have a certain degree of predictability built into them. Some people object to the term trust, but I think it's a perfectly legitimate term. Uh, so you take Norway and Belgium and Japan and Australia and South Korea. The United States has relationships with those countries that were based on predictable, reciprocal expectations. Country A will do this, country B will respond in a certain way. Um, Trust to me is the best way of encapsulating that in a short form. Australia won't pursue its own nuclear weapons capability. South Korea won't pursue its own nuclear weapons capability. Japan, Germany, because those countries trust in U.S. extended deterrence, that the United States is a treaty ally, and the United States will live up to that alliance. It's not the alliance in itself. My lawyer friends tell me all the time, law cannot exist without trust. There is no contract that is ironclad, right? You can't write a contract that addresses every single eventuality or possibility. At a certain point, you have to trust that your counterparty is going to view the relationship in the same way that you are going to view the relationship. And I think the reason that we have this undeclared hybrid covert war between the United States and China, and between the United States and Russia, really between the United States and China and Russia on who are allied with each other, is because both those countries regard the United States as irremediably hostile, existentially incompatible with their dictatorial rule, and therefore untrustworthy. And no treaty, no deal that we
Yeah.
made with those countries would satisfy their security concerns. And on the flip side, I think, again, until recently, where we've had some changes, I think Germany and Japan and South Korea and Australia essentially believe that the United States would guarantee their security, and that the United States believed that those countries would support the United States in its uh, uh, international security needs, as they did during the global war on terror, where all of our allies contributed in some way after 9/11 to the efforts in Afghanistan and trying to find terrorist threats to not just the United States, but the democratic world. So that's why I use that short form. It's not just treaties. It's not just transactions. It's relationships that matter.
I mean, the trust aspect is true. People can feel this in their own life, whether it's significant other, the relationship with their children as they grow older. I mean, it's in every aspect of your life. I mean, it doesn't matter what you pledge or vow or sign on the dotted line to. If there's no trust, I mean, good luck with that
Right.
thing holding its weight in
That's
water.
it. It's a
Yeah.
good point, right? We go to sleep every night with our significant other and count on the fact that we're going to wake up, even though we may have given them great incentives to do otherwise during the previous day.
Yeah.
And I think it's those relationships that you point out between and among countries that allow them to get over these frictions that arise. There were a number of frictions that arose among NATO allies or between the United States and Japan, or among the United States, Japan, and South Korea during the post-Cold War world. At no point did anyone actually question the value of the alliance.
Yeah. No, I agree. Glenn, we're coming to the end of our time together. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I think one, I would like people to think about what the consequences of changing alliances are, and the value of alliances. Um, we don't have alliances for other countries. We are not allied with NATO necessarily to benefit NATO altruistically. We're allied with NATO because that alliance has provided great benefit to the United States. It has provided security. I think China and Russia look at the United States alliance system with envy. They wish they had alliances. China, for example, is willing to sacrifice nuclear nonproliferation for not having a democratic North Korea on its border, or the end of North Korea on its border. Getting back to your previous question about China, and to China, democracy is a far greater threat. And so I want people to understand that China and Russia wish they had allies. We should probably not take ours for granted and understand the value that they've brought us, not just in this narrow question of proliferation, but overall in the security and political value that having alliances and allies means.
I couldn't agree more. That's man. And again, you can go right back to your own personal life with this. What are the value of the alliances and the relationships that you have in your life? And what would your life be without those? And how would you feel if you were isolated? You would have envy for those that have the ones that seem to be. You see this all the time. Like, you're like, man, that relationship is amazing. I wish I could have that. That social circle is amazing. I wish I could have that. It's probably underpinned in similar values and trust and all of those things. I think it's a great metaphor.
Well, it's great talking to you, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
Hope you enjoyed today's show. Hope it gets you thinking. Hope it gets you talking to your friends about these geopolitical issues that we do not often discuss. Thank you again for watching Change Agents, an Ironclad original, presented by Firecracker Farm. See you next week with an all-new guest and an all-new episode.
Why is it that Canada is, like you said, a global hub for transnational crime? Why do you think Canada has become kind of that hub for organized and foreign interference? What is it about it?
There's a lot of things going on, but first of all, it's an uninformed Canadian public that, like me, they grew up just thinking that Canada was free of crime, or that Canada had upright systems that weren't, vulnerable to corruption. And just to cut to the chase, we don't even have a racketeering law in Canada. Essentially, I think now, from corruption reasons, that is, there's a whole legal and political industry that's just getting rich off allowing money laundering and crime. But, the Canadian public hasn't been pushing for hardcore, anti-crime, anti-money laundering laws like the United States has. So the worst threat networks in the world, so the Chinese Communist Party, the Mexican cartels, Iranian threat networks, Hezbollah, of course, Italian organized crime. You crack down on it in New York City with the RICO Act. It came up to Canada. So we're just wide open, and yet the Canadian public, I say, the smart ones are willfully blind to it. And too many of the population, as I say, is just completely ignorant to the fact that Mexican cartels, as the more brutal ends, as you know, they're embedded around the world. They're extremely sophisticated, but as I say, they're being used at a higher level by the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party, their home base for Western Hemisphere is in Canadian cities. That's partly due to our huge, mostly honest diaspora population, but deeply infiltrated by Chinese spies, gangsters that are used by the party.
The Mexican drug cartels are rapidly expanding in Canada.
Canada has a real, or did have a real polished first world image. But what I found was that, polished cities like Vancouver, where people couldn't dig underneath the surface, were just being used egregiously, starting with Chinese triads, the Chinese Communist Party. And, as your associates know, let's say after 2005, the Sinaloa cartel and all the big cartels from Mexico, the most sophisticated actors, are starting to come into Vancouver too. And they're just using the city and the port as a massive money laundering and drug production hub, a transshipment hub for global narcotics. And I'm kind of frustrated with it. The Canadians that are denying Like, think about it. Every business person, in the world wants the American market. Why would the cartels be any different? And as you know, the American government has basically got military on the southern border, but for a good 20 years, the cartels have been setting up in a more sophisticated way along the northern border. And our government has just kept our public in the dark. So in a way, I got to think about it this way. I've developed trust over the past 10, 15 years where people at high levels in Canada and the United States will talk to me off the record and say, like, you're really onto it. So you got to help tell people what's going on because your laws need to change. I mean, if we don't get on this, and we're already not on it, we're going to start to see, and we already have, machine gun battle in our streets like Mexico. And so, yeah, I would say a big part of my job in my life for the past 10 years has been teaching Canadian people that the Chinese Communist Party is using Canada and using us deeply. I've been pretty successful in that. And in the last year or two, I'm showing how the cartel works hand in hand. They are so profitable and they'll do what the Chinese Communist Party needs them to do. I believe they'll be involved in intelligence gathering for, Iran and China because and I can back that up in terms of the encryption technology hubs that the Sinaloa cartel set up in Canada, again, as a weak spot, will blow people's mind. That's how deep it goes.
Let me hit that real quick. I'm curious about that. What do you mean by that? They've created encrypted communication hubs out there in Canada?